Hey gang, Dave Marcus, New York correspondent for the Federalist here. I'm joined today by Jarret Stepman from the Heritage Foundation. Hey Jarret,
Good to see you, Dave.
good to see you too. So Jarret is the author of really what is one of the most prescient books I think written of late, called "The War on History: The Conspiracy to Rewrite America's Past." Before we get into the broader points that your book raises, I want to ask you specifically about a statue of Teddy Roosevelt in front of the Museum of Natural History. As you know, myself and a few other people have organized a protest on Sunday at noon at the museum, at the statue, because the museum and the city have chosen to remove this statue of President Roosevelt. This actually comes up in your book. So can you tell us a little bit about the statue, the controversy, and what you think of the fact that they want to remove this?
Yeah, it is kind of typical that this thing is under assault right now, and I think a lot of cities and localities around the country are trying to get ahead of the mob, so to speak. This particular Roosevelt statue has actually had a little bit of controversy for a few years because of at least according to those who want to take it down, because of the way it depicts Theodore Roosevelt up on a horse. It has on one side a Native American, the other side is an African. And many are saying that this is inherently, it's racist, that it's a sign of prejudice. And also, especially if you read the New York Times article on the removal of the statue, it's actually pretty clear that they're making a case in general against Theodore Roosevelt. And I think that's very clear. I wrote about this statue at the time, that this would lead to a general assault on Theodore Roosevelt's legacy. Theodore Roosevelt stood for Americanism, this concept of no hyphenated Americans, that we were all Americans no matter where we came from, which I think is an incredibly important concept, especially right now in the United States. I think it's under assault. Theodore Roosevelt was a man who really gave the way for how America would introduce immigrants to this country by Americanizing them. That is very much passé in modern America of multiculturalism and things like this. So it's not surprising that Roosevelt has come under attack. Those who are saying that, well, it really is just about the depiction of the statue, not about Roosevelt. First of all, I'd say, if that was the case, why did they simply not remove the two secondary statues? And second of all, is there a plan to put another Theodore Roosevelt statue in its place? I don't think so. I guess they're.
I'm sorry. I want to hone in on something that you said about Roosevelt's legacy. Do you think that he's almost under more attack because he does represent somebody who, for his time, was very forward thinking in terms of race and had this vision of an America where all of the races could come together? I mean, do you think that the fact that somebody in the very early part of the 20th century was thinking that way fundamentally undermines a lot of the story that you say we're trying to rewrite, or the people are trying to rewrite?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because Theodore Roosevelt, I think one of the reasons, certainly I think that the artist picked those descriptions, is Theodore Roosevelt was very much a champion of Native Americans. In fact, there were very many at his inauguration. Many actual, one of them was Quanah Parker, who was a legendary Comanche war chief. He made that very much a part of his idea, this concept of the West. And not only that, I think it's important the fact that he invited Booker T. Washington, who was a great Black American, who was kind of a labor activist in his own day, advocated for civil rights for Black Americans. Theodore Roosevelt invited him to the White House to show solidarity. He got quite a bit of criticism in his own day for that move. There were a lot of people who didn't like that, who were racist toward Booker T. Washington. Theodore Roosevelt say, I can't understand the attitude of one man up and another man down in this country. He thought that concept was un-American. I mean, he thought that was just not an American idea. So, Theodore Roosevelt was. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just saying he was right, but
yeah, he was right. And so I think Theodore Roosevelt has certainly a great deal to teach us today. And I think, if anything, we need more of Roosevelt's concept of Americanism in the United States right at this moment. He was a kind of, you could say, nationalist. He saw the 20th century as an American century. You have to understand, as America was emerging from the 19th century, we had just come through a terrible civil war that nearly destroyed this country. Roosevelt saw the next step for America becoming the world's preeminent superpower. How are we going to do that? We're going to do that by integrating newcomers to this country. We're going to do that by being powerful and prosperous and having a role to play in world affairs. Theodore Roosevelt saw all those things coming. There's a reason why he is so celebrated. And on top of that, the man himself is kind of the image of the vigorous, the strong, youthful American who's willing to step into the arena at any moment. The man who's unafraid to defend his country. He represents an American elite at the time that was still in favor of those things. An American elite that was unafraid to declare itself unabashedly American. That's what Roosevelt stood for, and that's something that I think still is important for us today. I think for the statue topplers, the ones who want to get rid of history, those are the things that are really problematic. I think that those are the things that are going to ultimately get Theodore Roosevelt canceled and try to erase him from the minds of Americans, and why Americans who do still stand for what this country really does stand for should stand for Theodore Roosevelt right now. I think what you're doing, Dave, is a wonderful thing, standing for the statue, standing up for Theodore Roosevelt in front of a museum that, frankly, he and his family built. I mean, the collection there was started from a private collection from Theodore Roosevelt when he was a little boy, and his father putting up the money to do that. So the very fact is that museum wouldn't be there today if it wasn't for the contribution of the Roosevelts.
So let me broaden this out a little bit and ask you, when did you start this book? What was that a couple of years ago when you started writing the book?
It was a few years ago, and it kind of, some of these things were already starting to happen.
That's what I want to get at. Like, clearly you saw this coming, and clearly we've arrived. In the couple of minutes that we have left, what was it that you saw a few years ago that convinced you that we were quickly going to arrive at the moment where we are right now?
I think it's the explosion of, to a certain extent, my generation, millennials, who were raised as an education that no longer taught Americanism. A lot of young people were getting Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States at the K-12 level. Our elite was taught in schools that throughout the 90s and early 2000s was preaching a kind of anti-Americanism. And I think we're seeing the fruit of all of that. I think it's kind of coming full bloom at this moment. And that's why I never thought, especially when the debate kind of started over Confederate monuments a few years ago, I never thought that was the ultimate target. Because if you listen to the rhetoric of what's going on in our schools, especially higher education, they're gunning for the United States. They're gunning for Western civilization. They think everything that it was built on was malignant, that it was rotten, that it's imperfect and it needs to be perfected. And I think that rhetoric's been around for a long time. We're simply seeing the transformation of America into a vast college campus. The kids who were raised with this didn't simply grow up and become conservatives. They became radical revolutionaries. They became people who embraced a kind of cultural revolution in this country where we're purging the past to bring forth a fundamental transformation of America. And I think right now, especially everything that's going on, they see this as their moment, and they're willing to use mobs. They're willing to use anything to gain power and erase America's past, erase its collective memory of the things that it was, both good and bad.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for spending this time, and I really do hope that everyone will run out and grab your book, because you really lay it out, and this is certainly not the end of this conversation. I don't know who they're coming after next, but I mean, at this point, really could be anyone, I guess,
Mount Rushmore.
Mount Rushmore. All right. Jarret, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Okay.